I did make sticky toffee pudding. I made sticky toffee pudding for in between Christmas and Thanksgiving, and it was really good. I was surprised how good it was. The British every once in a while make a good pudding.
No, we got many good puddings. See, here, this is why I find this subject so frustrating too. Name an American pudding. If you don't have dishes of your own, you shouldn't get to judge other countries' dishes, right?
American desserts.
And cherry pie. That's it, right? Cherry pie. I'll give you
Apple
cherry
pie, pecan pie. We
Apple
do
pie is not
pies.
American. You do pies, but you didn't do pies before everybody else. You just got on the pie bandwagon. You got on the pie wagon.
You guys do meat pies. I can watch the Great British Bake Off.
No, Christmas mince pies, hundreds and hundreds of years old, older than your country.
Isn't minced meat?
No,
it's minced.
it's not. No,
What's in minced pie?
It's like a Christmas cake, but it's sweeter. Check it out.
A Christmas cake. What the hell is a Christmas cake?
Oh my gosh! You see, this is what I'm talking about. You shouldn't get to judge other countries' foods if you don't have any dishes of your own.
45 classic American desserts for the history books. Cheesecake, New York cheesecake.
Oh my God! It's not even a dessert.
Cobbler. I think we invented cobbler. Although I'm basing this on the Great British Bake Off, and you all had an episode of the Great British Bake Off called American Pies because you were doing something special.
But it wasn't like American pies as in you created them. You just put different shit in pies. A pie's a pie, right?
Yeah, but that's like saying no.
You don't get to say you invented the sandwich if you put like toenails.
I wasn't saying we invented
right?
the sandwich. I was saying there are types of pies that we absolutely invented.
Yeah, I don't buy that. You just took pies and you put different stuff in them.
I'm not taking credit for the pie concept. I'm saying it seems like we were the ones to do a couple of these for the first time. Key lime pie, probably.
But I feel like it's also just misleading, right? Because some chef in some little kitchen in England, probably 300 years ago, made a cherry pie and was like, yeah, this is just not catching on. So already created, just not documented and not widespread. So there really are no American desserts that you can call your own.
Baked Alaska. It's got Alaska in the name.
I know. Yeah.
Looks like we did a bunch of cookies, snickerdoodles.
Philly cheesesteak. Yeah, it's just a cheesesteak.
I'm not claiming
sandwich.
that's a dessert.
Just because they put Philly in the name, it became an American sandwich, right? It's nothing. No, nothing. American.
Listen, I will Google the etymology and origin of desserts, and I will come back in a future episode and prove that we've done stuff. Not that I tend to agree that American, like there's a really good clip of Tom Holland talking to an interviewer and being like, you don't have any American food. And the guy was like, we have hamburgers. And Tom Holland was like, you know where Hamburg is, right? Like, no. French fries. His other example is French fries. And Tom Holland's like, listen to yourself. Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the chat from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper on the human element. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that than Kevin and I.
Until the AI bots replace us someday. Before we get into this week's show, I'd like to quickly remind folks that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com or submit them on the Discord and the User Stories channel, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. Now, on this week's show, we'll be talking about all of the reasons why engineers seem so resistant to using someone else's code, whether that's buying or licensing solutions from third parties, relying on low-code, no-code solutions, or even sometimes just using open source packages that are out there for free. Engineers seem to love writing their own code, and we'll dig into why and whether that's always the right call. I understand, I think we're going to talk about why engineers think this way and also why the business sort of pushes back and some of those scenarios that are out there today that make this a more interesting conversation. But it is, I don't know, if I put my engineer hat on. One, I like writing the code, and two, sometimes what I'm forced to pick and use from other systems doesn't actually do what I'm being asked, and so it's frustrating. I don't know. We might be jumping ahead in the
No,
actual talking points.
no, that's fine. Because from a high level, I don't disagree. I will say this: it's sometimes the engineer's code doesn't actually do what the product team were expecting to, right?
Sure.
I think in those scenarios, there's always a time to write code, but I've seen it go to excessive degrees, right? So
Sure.
we can talk about that. And then there's also a valid argument from engineers, and not to pick on certain platforms, but as we get in and talk about Salesforce, right? And the problem is not Salesforce or their technology; it's the type of engineer that exists in a platform like Salesforce and the type of solutions they build. And so that can be dangerous too. So we can talk a little bit about how sometimes no code, low code can be abused.
I feel like this is also just a recurring theme with us in some of these topics, which is whether it was agile, whether it was HR software, whether it's this, people have frustrations and they take it out on the thing that they're dealing with at the moment. But their real frustration is you're in an organization that doesn't value the things that would make this easier. You've got a bad manager, you don't have a scrum process that supports you, you are not necessarily trained to be creating the level of code that's necessary. And so if you're a product person getting frustrated with the output, if you're an engineer who's getting frustrated with some of the code you're seeing from others, that's not the low code, no code fault. That is the fault of the organization prioritizing or deprioritizing investments in certain areas. And I just wonder that sometimes frustrations get taken out on the tooling or the set or the thing that they're dealing with. And actually, no, it's a company wide issue. Are you prioritizing? Your company has decided that all of your internal tools are going to be managed now by low code, no code resources, and you're frustrated with how you need to plug into that. You're not really frustrated with the low code, no code. You're frustrated with the company deciding that it is going to go down that road. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I think that's true. I think platforms often get pulled into the middle of the argument, and I spend a lot of time in my technology life saying we all have bias. Even me, I have bias. I'm aware of it, and the fact that I wear it on my sleeve and admit to my bias is hopefully to get other people to maybe self-reflect and recognize their own bias and try shed a little bit of it. But we get drawn in, and quite often the solutions, whether it's no code, low code, or other big data platforms, whatever, they quite often get pulled to the center of the argument, and it's frustration, lack of direction. However, I will also say that one of the most common anti-patterns I've seen is engineers who don't really appreciate the goal of the company they work for. And it's great, it's powerful, because they could be an engineer in biotech, they can be an engineer in finance, they could be an engineer in marketing, or whatever kind of technology. The reality is, though, is that they care about writing code and they don't care about revenue at all.
Sure. Before we get into all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Process Stories, where we talk about systems and frameworks that software teams use to get their work done. So today's topic is the eternal debate over build versus buy. Do you build solutions in-house with your engineering teams, or do you buy or license an existing solution? And I think even that is probably oversimplifying this conflict. Sometimes it's a question of whether to build just the 40% that is your company's unique value proposition and let some of the fundamentals like data access or user authentication, things like that, be managed by existing third-party libraries and solutions that you can sometimes get for free or for various levels of license costs. But there are also many different factors at play simultaneously here. There are motives and incentives that engineers have. There are motives and incentives that the business has. There are newer solutions like low code, no code that are challenging assumptions about who even needs to do this work some of the time. The usage of AI is expanding in engineering circles, allowing the machine to write some of the code for you. This has been a debate for decades, and I think it's only getting more complicated with all of this. So I've tried to break this topic down into buckets that we can talk through each of them. There's engineering motivations. Why do engineers often prefer to build and write their own code? There are business motivations. Why does the company often want to buy existing solutions to replace or supplement engineering efforts? There are challengers, sort of, as I was saying, challenging the assumptions of what goes into these decisions, things like AI and low code, no code. They're offering alternative paths and are facing both eager adoption and plenty of condemnation. And then I don't think people have really good frameworks in place to evaluate this. The debate often devolves into how people feel, and there's very human motivations involved. But I do think that, you've written an article for the blog. There are methodical ways to evaluate some of the pros and cons and make that decision that can keep people happy. So I think we can just start to talk through all of these.
Let's go back to the engineering motivations, right? So,
Yeah.
and it ranges in my mind, or at least some of my observations. It ranges all the way from zero thought, low energy to explore alternatives and to explore commercial or even open source, right? So it's interesting because it's not even a build versus buy, it's a build versus buy versus acquire, right? Like as open source, you can you can get by a lot of the solutions. You're only paying for your infrastructure costs and scaling. So
Right.
and then I've seen the motivated engineers who've actually made good arguments for why we're building that. I think there's an interesting conversation that links the engineering motivations to the business motivations in a way that we've talked about in another episode when we talk about generic domains of a business. Traditionally, the bigger companies that didn't commit to tying in that generic domains, things like accounting practices and payroll, even their employee data, right? Companies that didn't commit to building good technology organizations and engineering groups around those disciplines, they tend to do well by implementing things like no code, low code solutions because they don't get a lot of resource capacity from the engineering teams. And so it's left for small, not necessarily fourth generation language teams to get their teeth into, and they can really build quickly on top of the Microsoft framework and other no code, low code solutions. On the engineering side, what is odd is that again, you can start to look at the domains, and then as you start to analyze what is our secret sauce? Like what is the differentiator? What do we need to build because it's something that nobody else has got? That to me is where you should start thinking about. Okay, there's definitely code, right? Or customization of technologies, because it's not always writing code from scratch. It could be taking an open source platform and extending it, and there are plenty that do that. We can get into that. And so for me, there's a lot of considerations, and it's interesting to see on the bigger company and the mid to big size companies, you can see you can guess where the no code, low code solutions are coming in.
I suppose we should define a low code, no code solution are tools like Microsoft Power Apps. What was the other one that you sent me the name of that we landed on? It starts with an A.
There's OutSystems, UiPath is a big one. That's an RPA. ServiceNow, Appian.
Appian, there you go. Appian was the other one. So Appian and Microsoft Power Apps are the ones that I used. And I was using this in 2020, and before that was like 2016. So it's been a while. They could have gotten better, but it was a visual interface that helps you basically build UIs and workflows. You're drag and drop. This box connects to that box, and the first box is a database, and the second box is a bunch of business rules, and the third box is the database it's going to end up in. And you don't need to understand any of the things that are going on behind all of that. You're simply giving instructions about what to process. Same thing with UIs that you're developing. You are putting in, this is the text box. These are the 4 questions I need to ask them. They click this button. What happens as a result of that? Sometimes you're able to enter in little business rules, logic in like a JavaScript style language. But even then, they were giving you UIs to be able to decide what to do if the person's email address is invalid. And they put a bunch of really handy capabilities packaged up.
Another entry point for the business there is platforms like Salesforce, where it's baked into the solution, right? No code and low code solutions, building complex workflow for users inside of Salesforce. So yeah, those are some of the parameters that you see in the big companies that can drive the decisions and sort of tell you what kind of culture you're working in.
Well, and I think that's why this conversation isn't universal, right? If you are in those big companies or even mid-sized companies, there's a distinction between, are you an engineering team who is, to your point, trying to support those generic business domains and figuring out how the accounting software needs to talk to the finance and accounting are the same thing. The accounting software needs to talk to the HR software, needs to talk to the sales software, needs to do all of those kinds of things. And those engineering teams absolutely are facing those questions of, why are you building it yourself? There's low code, no code, there's existing things you could license. But even if you are an enterprise or mid-sized company, but especially if you're a startup, you're most likely on an engineering team that is facing your unique capability. And so I think that's where there are just 2 entirely different conversations. If you are offering unique capabilities to your clients and you are building the thing that provides the revenue and the value, then the conversation for the engineers about why are we letting someone else build that is totally valid versus, to your point, why aren't we just having someone code the low code, no code Salesforce integration?
So that's interesting. As 2 startup guys, right, which we get to call ourselves, did you ever feel pressure to have more code because it made us more valuable as a company?
No. So I think that's why I kind of want to get into the psychology of the engineer a little bit, because my question in those situations is, do you want more code of the things you do well, or do you want more code because you just want full 100% control over every single piece of your platform? And the idea of using someone else's database access layer, the idea of using someone else's user authentication automation capability, there are these generic domains even within the value revenue generating software. So you're not hooking up your accounting system to your Salesforce system, but you are writing the platform that your clients are going to log into. But why are you writing the user login code for those clients? Why are you writing the MongoDB connector for that platform? Why aren't you just using someone else's code to do that for you? And that's where I think the conversation gets tricky, because it's not that I'm trying to generate more code for my value. It is that I might think I have such a unique requirement in a unique situation. The only way we deliver value to the client is if our database connection can do, and I've been in this situation. We had situations where we were using Mongo and a graph database. And so I didn't have a single connection layer that could handle writing data to both. And so I needed to wrap around the Mongo connector, my own connector, that was able to make those calls. And so I had to write more code to do that. And I think that was an acceptable trade-off. I didn't write the Mongo connector from scratch, but I did write the little wrapper from scratch. And maybe I could have done some research to figure out there was an existing solution out there, but speed was a component of it. My own feeling of uniqueness was a component of it. So I don't know that I would categorize it as volume of code drove my perception of value. It was trying to make sure that the thing I did uniquely was truly unique. And I don't know that that's always the feeling that engineers have in those evaluations.
That's what I'd say. So my respect Kevin moment for this week would be to say, yes, because you and some of the other engineers I've worked with who shall remain nameless, I don't put you on that low IQ side.
Do we want to find a better way of phrasing that to not insult half the people listening?
Well, most of the people I've worked with, okay, there we go. We covered everybody.
No. I'm saying the low IQ qualifier. I think there are degrees of experience and skill that engineers bring to the table that make these decisions different.
The low emotional IQ. Is that better? EQ.
No.
The low EQ. The low emotional intelligence.
Okay.
It is, though. Okay, because honestly, I'll fight for this because when you hear my point, it's one thing to think to myself, I'm going to build this because I've exhausted my research. Because there comes a point when it's too much research. You're saying this is becoming expensive for you to keep researching, right? We got to fix this. Then there's a person who kind of your decision, which was I could have gone and looked for something, but one, there's I could do it in this time frame, and two, it fit nicely into the framework I was building. There's still a thought process. There's still emotional intelligence to that decision. I actually genuinely believe, though, we have engineers. This is not an insult, because I don't think that all engineers are necessarily thinking about the business they work in. There are engineers that do not have that thought process when they go to write that code. They don't think to themselves, there is a solution out there, right? Because they're not tracking, oh, by the way, big data started to include all these other peripherals that support big data platforms over the years. For example, how many engineers know about change data capture in databases? The disciplines that they're not familiar with progressed to the point, and they didn't progress into those areas. Very similar to the old world where, remember what it was to be a full stack developer. We knew a couple of databases, we knew a UI, client interface language, and then we knew enough of a 4GL or something that could build the business logic, right? And some of us actually thought we'd never need to know more than that. We were like, this is it. This is my career. I'm going to be doing this forever. Full stack engineering with these 3 or 4 things. Now we know hundreds, right?
Right.
And we're at a level where we do know, hey, change data capture, big data concept, I can streaming, blah, 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 blah. I still think we have engineers, and this is not a knock on them. It's a knock on the companies and the teams they work on to allow them to make decisions without thinking about what's best for the business, which is what is our secret sauce.
And I think that is where I go back to why I think I've pushed back on you in a couple of these conversations around like Agile and other ones where these are because the world is so complex now, and to your point, because we can't necessarily know that everybody's going to have the depth of that experience, it needs to be this squad concept where you have, in partnership with a bunch of people, you have a more senior engineer who might be exclusively on the cloud scaling side of things, and you have the UI engineer who knows how you're going to try to implement that into whatever JavaScript framework. You have the product owner or product manager who understands the business value that you're getting out of it and the time to value that's an important component of that. And so all of you together should be identifying this kind of stuff. And I think that's where I don't think every one of our episodes needs to devolve into why Agile is broken, but no one actually is doing agile the right way. And so when you have engineers just making decisions by reading the user story and making their own call without all of that extra context, that's why I like a Marty Kagan style where you come back and say it has to be this collaborative small little team that are making these decisions together, so that the engineer who just thinks, oh, well, it's just a data access thing, I need to go and write my data access code, you have the UI person who's like, no, wait, I was on a team that we didn't do it that way. And the product owner is saying, wait, what's that doing to my effort estimate? How long is it going to take us to get to these things? And it's a collaborative decision to find the right solution, not just the solution that is the first thing that comes to the engineer's mind. And that's not a knock on the engineer. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and all some engineers have is a hammer through experience and complexity of ecosystems and a bunch of valid reasons.
I wonder if we could, because it's interesting. It's interesting you brought agile into the conversation, because I sort of view that as it's the flavor, right? It's the context, it's the methodology that we've subscribed to. To me, it's actually a mentality, right? It's not just in technology too. I get phone calls from people all the time telling me, "Hey, I've got a good idea," and they tell me, and I say, "Did you Google search this? Like, wouldn't that be the first thing you would do?" And
Right.
they're not silly people. These people are smart people. It's just there's not that same appetite to go and research. It's scary to me that we're still struggling with some of the really primitive fundamental elements. And one should be, when you're in a team, you should absolutely understand what the important pieces of code to write are, what drives the revenue, what leads to growth, right? And we don't, but I don't know if that's just agile. I think that's
No. I wasn't trying to place it at the blame of Agile. I was just simply pointing out that Agile hasn't fixed that either,
yes,
right? And so,
absolutely, yes.
yeah, I do think that there is, let's set aside the fact that there is a part of this industry which is a level of developer experience, expertise. I think there's entire swaths of industries that have been put out of business, and the answer has been, well, learn to code. And so now we have a bunch of people who learn to code as a career path, not necessarily as an aptitude or a preference or a personal driver. And so the quality of those engineers, through no fault of their own, this is not a criticism of them, they found themselves in situations where they can write some amount of code, and for a bunch of companies that was sufficient. But then when you find yourself in this more challenging situation and you're now writing code you shouldn't have because you should have had that thought process to go and find other solutions, and those are the engineers that I wonder would benefit from this evolution towards AI and low code, no code, helping them be the people who can supplement teams where you do need some expertise, but you don't need the level of decision making. I go back to, this is a multi-pronged conversation. Are you talking about internal tools, internal connections, non-client facing, non-revenue generating solutions? If you're on the revenue generating solution, then I think we need to start to expect more from people, and that is not always how engineers find themselves through their career paths. And I think you're right. There's just a general, how do you account for that? How do you deal with the fact that this industry has some percentage, I don't know if it's 40% or 60% or what it is, but some amount of people who find themselves in roles that they're just not equipped for because they haven't had the correct experience and upbringing into this industry that prepares them to make these decisions. And my answer to that is, I don't know that we are going to solve for that. I don't know that we should solve for that. Shouldn't we supplement those people with a squad around them who can help them get better at that and make those decisions by learning from other people? I don't know. And again, I want to be mindful that this is not denigrating folks who have found themselves in these new careers. That's great and that's amazing, and I'm really glad that we have that opportunity. I just do think that we need to support them and make sure that they are in roles that what they are producing is at the level that companies need. And again, I go back to, that's why the AI and the low code seem like a really helpful solution for those folks. And every time I say those folks, I feel bad about trying to sort of other them in this conversation. Again, that's not the goal. It is just, it depends on, I don't know how to phrase it. I don't want to sound elitist and like we're trying to kick a bunch of engineers out of the engineering world. That's not the goal, at least my goal in this conversation. It is to find the right places for them and ways that they can absolutely add a ton of value to companies that need a technical skill set to do some of these things. It just isn't quite the same. And how do we support them in getting to that point or finding the roles that work for them? I don't know.
Yeah, and I just wonder, is there ever going to be a decent handbook for engineering leaders? There's obviously
Sure.
anti-pattern publications, but these feel like principles to me, right? And
Right.
comp science
And
is
we don't do
20
that.
years. We don't.
We don't do that at all. Yeah.
We don't go back to these principles at all.
I don't want to let the good I shouldn't say good. I don't want to let the more experienced engineers off the hook. And I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I do think there is an entire part of this conversation, which is simply you're also the engineer who's been doing this for 10, 15, 20 something more years. And your resistance to using libraries or licensed solutions or whatever it is, that resistance is based in something else. It is not a lack of knowledge. It is, I don't know if it's you like coding. And so the more coding you get to do, the more fun you have in your job. And the idea of cutting some of that out is bad. You are concerned about feeling relevant to the organization, and the more things you don't have to write, you get worried about job security. There's motivations there that I'd be curious to dig into.
Yeah, let me talk about one of the more motivated versions of that too. And it's not malicious. And I can think of characters throughout my career I've worked with like this. And I've been in this mindset myself even. And it's much more like a solutions driven approach, which is I'm going to start building the system, and you get 100 steps in, right? You're building lambdas, you're building step functions, you're building this, you're building that, you're tying in technology, and you get to step 12,560, and you realize that step 1700 is affected by your current code. So instead of going back and analyzing the break of your sort of procedural process and the code you wrote at that step, you add a step 12,651 to address the problem all the way back here. And I've seen that in architecture where there's no design, there's no componentization, there's no diagrams that explain the system at component level. It is purely they come in dealing with things. It's a chaotic sprint, and they're throwing in, adding, and at some point they have to go back in the system. But instead of addressing it like a component in the architecture, they just fix it in an extra step. It's so procedural, which is fine for code, but when you build architecture that way, it is scary. That is the scariest kind of architecture I've ever seen, and it's almost impossible to unravel because you start to find it's not even skeletons in the closet. It's you find a femur in the closet, but you know there's the rest of the body somewhere. But you've just got to wait for the system to break to find the rib cage. It is disastrous trying to fix that type of architecture.
So I guess so in that situation, you're saying I realized step 1700 way back earlier is just fundamentally different. And if I wanted to change it the correct way, there's probably we should have just been using this existing AWS service. We should have gone and gotten this library that just does all of these first 1700 steps for us more correctly, more scalable, more whatever we just didn't build at the time. And so now it's not even a question of who cares what the past was, why we should or shouldn't have gone build versus buy back on steps 1 through 1700. Now we're in this situation, and the daunting task in front of me of unwinding all of these subsequent decisions is too much. And so we never are given the ability. That also goes back to the agile conversation of when things aren't actually agile and you're still on a date driven, well, okay, but now we're realizing the correct way to not build up even more tech debt is to have another 7 sprints that we have to add to the estimate to unwind all of this and really do the right thing the right way. No business driver is going to look at that and say, oh, sure, of course, we don't get the feature now until April.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to explain to because architectures like that, they get handed off. The longer they exist, they get handed off. Then it becomes a real life case study, right? Like, how do you unravel this architecture? How much into the tech debt do you go, right? Like, it's a real order and it's a real pleasure to figure out the bits you have to fix first. But how do you explain that to non-technical folk? How much detail do you go into to explain that to less technical folk from beyond your organization? That I've seen from non-malicious people. And
I think there's something similar to that, which is even if you do decide it's worth going down the road of swapping that part out, depending on what that is, that fundamental thing, that database connection, that something else, that streaming pipeline, whatever it is, depending on what you need and therefore the vendor that you find that you can do that. It's one thing if it's AWS or Microsoft or Google or something foundational that is this massive billion-dollar company that is clearly stable in doing those kinds of things, and you can say, okay, I can rely on that, versus you go and find, there are 3 companies that have done that, but 2 of them are startups and the other one's only been around for 5 years. And now as the engineer, I'm going to put myself on the hook for the stability and the performance of this thing. And I'm going to then, when it breaks, it's not because my code broke, it's because their code broke. And now I'm the one who's getting screwed by the fact that this third party is breaking. And yet I'm the person who's facing the business and the customers. I can understand also a trade-off being like, or I could write my code that I know know is going to be, even if it has bugs, I at least can go and solve it. And if I have to stay up until 9 p.m. solving it, I can do that. I don't want to be dependent on this third party.
That's exactly right. Where I get scared is when the senior guys, as you started the conversation, the senior engineers, when the emotional intelligence is there and it's shaped and it's biased and it is fueled by control and it is fueled by, well, I just want to code.
Sure.
Because it's not your sandbox, right? This company is not your sandbox, right? That's fundamental.
There's probably a little bit of, I don't mean ego in a bad way. It is faith in themselves. It is the fact that I've done this for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and I built a thing that is now $100 million in revenue. I know what I'm doing. Therefore, my own confidence is telling me that I can do this thing. And I think they might be right. And I think that I'm not saying that this isn't a conversation you should have. It's saying, what are the trade-offs? So, okay, great. You want to go and make version 2 of this thing that you built 4 years ago and make it even better and do even more things. What's the effort to do that versus the value we're getting out of it? Just because you develop this really cool idea and you have confidence that you're going to do it really well, it's going to take you 10 sprints to do that. That's 20 weeks. That's almost half a year to do that. I'm not getting that much value out of this cool thing that you want to go and build. And so there has to be, and the problem you probably run into is a lot of organizations don't have trust and good relationships between product and engineering. And so when the product person tries to push back and say, yeah, but the value we're getting out of this feature is only 10% of the overall solution I need us to build in the next 6 months. And what you're telling me is to build that 10%, you're going to take half my time. That math doesn't add up. And if the relationship between product and engineering isn't good, both sides aren't going to hear each other and try to figure out, okay, maybe it doesn't make sense to build 100% of what you want to build, but could you build 30% of it that only does the things we need? Or could we just go license a library or something from somebody that does all of it for us and we're going to get it with a single contract? Maybe there's budget reasons why that isn't a possibility. Like, there's so many aspects of this conversation, and if the relationship isn't good, or even if the relationship is good, people can get stuck in analysis paralysis and be like, well, I don't know how to balance the budget of the licensed version versus the losing functionality of the free version versus the losing time of the home built version. That's a complex conversation. And again, it's just skill sets. If your product manager and your engineering people don't have the analysis skill set to make that decision, it just goes back and forth. I'm giving everyone a little bit of a free pass because it's really hard. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm saying you need to have ways of evaluating this without the emotion, with the constraints in place. And I don't know.
I think it's interesting. I also switch in onto the business motivations here. So here's where it gets a little interesting, because we are starting to see the hybrid. We're starting to see people like yourself who have really, really strong business backgrounds, really, really strong technology backgrounds, and also inspirational, able to lead a team of hybrids like myself.
Sure.
Those types of teams, what they deliver in no-code and low-code solutions in the very near future, and actually probably some companies today, what those teams are delivering will rival what has been coded in the past. So engineers, there's obviously going to be many situations where that's not true, like really high performance, low latency, super high volume, elasticity in the infrastructure and code, not true. But there's a lot of solutions that will come out of increasingly technologically savvy business teams in the future that could potentially start play on the minds of CEOs and business leaders as to, well, why do I need so many engineers? You guys built this in 3 weeks in Microsoft, which we're licensed to use as part of our corporate licensing. You guys built this in 3 weeks, connecting to the same databases that my engineers would have connected to. Once that secret gets more out into the world, it could be an interesting period of change.
Well, and that, again, I go back to, I'm not convinced, at least in what I've seen. So I think we can talk about the challengers to some of these assumptions, AI, low code, no code. AI, I think, has some interesting things with, Microsoft Copilot and other things where they're trying to help an engineer get to the complex code faster by writing the boring code for you. Low code, no code, at least maybe, and this is sort of my question about, I haven't looked at some of these tools in probably 5 or 6 years. Maybe they've gotten much better, but the version 1.0 of these was really ugly. Like, it looked like a Visual Basic app from 1992, right? Like, it was not a thing that you would want to use unless you are building an internal tool. And so I think I still come back to the split between, are you a revenue generating engineer in a client customer facing solution, or are you an internal tools engineer in something trying to do things for your internal users? And I'm not saying you should punish your internal users with bad UIs, but the level of interaction and capability seems less. And so I don't know. I go back and forth whether or not those low code things are a challenge challenge to all engineers or just to certain types of engineers? And even then, I also go back to engineers 30 years ago had to manage all their memory. They were writing C++ code and had to figure out how to do everything. And then Java and .NET came along and were, managing a bunch of that stuff for you. And you were now writing at the next level. SQL Server and Oracle were starting to do a bunch of the capabilities. Create index is a thing that you can now just call, and it just does all of the auto optimization of your data for you. And when you're trying to query, React and Angular on the front end abstract a ton away from what you used to have to write in JavaScript. NoSQL solutions like Mongo, big data solutions like Hadoop, they all have started to abstract more and more things away from the engineer. And now you're writing on top of systems that are on top of systems that are on top of systems. And you have no idea how all of these things are writing to the disk and handling the memory management. You're just assuming it does that for you. That's not always the case, but for a huge chunk of engineers, that is the case. So is it okay that AI is writing some code for you and low code, no code is abstracting even more of the code away from you? You've already been on that path. If you've been an engineer for the past 10 plus years, that's already been your life. You've already written less code in places and let other frameworks do that for you. So that's been the natural evolution of engineers. And is this just the next evolutionary step for a bunch of them? Not for all of them, but for a bunch of them.
I think so. I think it's going to be an interesting evolutionary step. And I've seen no code, low code that rivals coded solutions. I'm not worried that low code, no code is not ready for prime time from a visual perspective or a functionality perspective. I would say Microsoft Power App, I could build a mortgage application in Power Apps and it would be as equal quality visually and performance wise as a fully coded solution.
Okay.
I am a Microsoft poster boy, but I don't want to be known as the Microsoft poster boy. But we're not just talking about no code, low code solution for little websites and mobile apps. Like this thing sits on top of your Azure infrastructure, right? So as I start to get into more complex conversations about data mesh and data lakes and lake houses, like, look, these apps are sitting on top of the same production data that our products are sitting on top of. So I can build some really elegant and sophisticated applications. And I'm always disturbed when I get to big or medium-sized companies and they sit on top of an operating system and an enterprise license and really don't understand the automation and the no-code, low-code options that are available to them within their enterprise subscription. Man, you're sitting on top of this thing and it's insanely powerful. And I don't mean like they looked at it and tried it and didn't like it. I mean, they don't know they're sitting on this stuff.
Well, and I wonder how much of that is just, I've been in conversations where I'm looking at a thing that engineering has already built or is starting to build. And I'm like, Airflow is a thing that just manages your workflows for you now, right? Like we don't have to do all of that. And there are perfectly valid situations in which Airflow is too restricting. And so you absolutely still have weird situations where the user is able to pause a thing and you need to, I'm not saying Airflow or solutions like that are the only way that you need to do that, but a lot of cases where these pipelines just need to be managed can go through tools. And so I am curious, is that a failure of marketing? Is that a failure of curiosity on the engineering side? Is that a failure of we are no longer, I go back to our Stumble Upon and Dig episode, the internet is no longer feeling small and there's too much information out there. And so how would you even help engineers discover that this is a thing if that's not I don't know how you solve that, but there is absolutely a lack of understanding of what's available to you in your cloud infrastructure and even in your on-prem solutions that you could go in. Airflow is open source and free. Now there's an enterprise supported version of it that costs you money, but there's so much out there that you could take advantage of that no one thinks about or does. And yeah, maybe that's part of this, the engineering incentives and motivations world is just like, what is the blocker there and what can we do to clear that blocker?
Well, it's interesting. We're drawing the line between big data and developers now because the big data and just data world in general has gone there, right? Talk about Airflow, Arrow, NiFi. You could pull a handful out of the Apache stack and say infinitely scalable, free, commercial offerings if I want, connectors up the wazoo. So if it has those fringe cases where, hey, I don't want to do my ETL inside of Apache NiFi, it's like, great, well then, stream your data out and its orchestration, do your transformation and stream it back in, or dump it into an enterprise data cloud offering, query or something in AWS, Snowflake, any of these. The engineering, the software engineering world, the application architecture is struggling to close the gap, but I'd argue the data architecture, I don't even know how they embraced it. They just did, right? It just moved. And there's a lot of elegant solutions in the big data space today.
How much of that is just a systemic side effect? So already historically, teams were often not always, but often split that way anyways. You already had your data admins and your data focused people, and that was not the same person who was writing the C# code. That was not the same person who was writing the JavaScript UI code. So you already kind of had that split. And so those teams' ability to learn a new thing, embrace it, and go and see the benefit of it, they were encouraged to do that. They had a bunch of capacity and they were solving a big, huge problem and delivering results, but they were delivering results without needing the application layer to change, without needing the UI layer to change. And so they could go and do that independently. I wonder that the rest of the engineering world, those sort of, you say people were full stack, but even when you were full stack, you weren't necessarily full stack. Usually meant API, business layer, and UI. It sometimes meant a little bit of database, but you weren't really your database admin. You weren't the one figuring out how to get Oracle or SQL Server to scale and do all of that kind of stuff. That was a weird hybrid of data skill and IT skill. And I just wonder that this is leftovers, that though the rest of the engineers who didn't go on that journey with people, they just simply got a faster database query as a result of people moving on to Hadoop.
I think you bring up an interesting point there. Engineers still, I think we still get caught up in that abstraction, the romantic side of engineering. Like, and you're sort of making mature decisions to say, but you know what? The minute I start writing C# code to do data transformations, I've gone too far. I can offload that to some data stack. So it's interesting to watch the big data space embrace these tools, and it's frustrating to watch the software engineering not. And you still see it. I see it every time I work with Salesforce at the enterprise. Whenever I work with Salesforce, it's not quite the same as a product technology distrust. It's almost like a lack of respect for the engineers working on the Salesforce side, right? Like it's like, oh, it's no code. It's some workflow designer. Don't worry, we'll fix it on our side when we get that data out of there. Some of that stems from absolutely there are business guys in building solutions inside of Salesforce that have no right to do so, and they're not necessarily thinking about data concepts like, hey, by the way, this table actually Salesforce is not the system of record. So I think there are considerations. There are moments in those arguments when I've been like, yeah, let's work and have a better architecture design around Salesforce and integrations.
And I think that's the double-edged sword of that low code, no code, opening up the doors to additional people. We've already talked about, we opened up the doors of engineering, writing actual code for people who were taking that on as a second career and weren't necessarily educated is too strong of a word, but their experience and their motivators weren't necessarily the same as the kid who went to college because he was such a geek, he wanted to, or she wanted to figure out what to write. And so now low code, no code's opening the door to even more people who are not necessarily going to apply the principles that you probably need to have in place if the low code, no code isn't enforcing. I don't know, like it gets tricky. It's a double-edged sword.
It sounds like if we talk about the challenges, what's been your experience? Have you used any no code, low code solutions?
I will say the last time, to my point earlier, some of those UIs were very basic feeling, and like you could feel that it was a template driven solution. And so if that's gotten better and we now can build things that feel customer facing, but definitely when I was using them, it was not a thing I would put in front of a customer. It was a thing I would give to my internal sales team or my internal professional services team as a stopgap to get them to be able to run some automation, run some code without having to build the UI myself.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention too, like just because it's no code, low code doesn't necessarily mean you're not reaching out to external APIs to do more complex things, right? Like my no code, low code application can reach into the same engine that's running in production that has some complex secret sauce magic data flow, right? And I can reach in there. I urge people to go take a look at some of the no code solutions, certainly around the mobile and tablet technology, right? Like I think of Flutter is an interesting framework, right? I believe it's Google, but Flutter Flow is one that I think to myself, okay, that's great, right? Like I'm now putting that ability for a non-technical person who just has a business idea. And I've actually been and worked with several startup owners who built these platforms themselves using frameworks like Flutter Flow. What I love about those people is they do not give a crap about the meat in the middle because that's not their business, right? They're not technologists. They are, sometimes they're selling themselves and they're like, hey, by the way, I run a fitness program online, but I want to have my subscribers and I want them to have a social feel about it. So they're almost like the best product guys because they're really focused on the product themselves or the business. And then they start to look at the application that they're building with that in mind always, right? And so they're innovators to me. They're non-technical, but they actually managed to get milk out of the goat, right? So
In that situation, so I've always thought of low code, no code as the internal thing, the thing that's going to make the internal tool, the Salesforce to the accounting system connector, the whatever the little data entry UI is that we need to have people entering in from whatever the field reps who are out there collecting information in the field, and they need to be able to enter information really quickly for internal systems. It sounds like though it's matured at least to the point that maybe in some cases you can have that be customer facing part of the revenue generation side of things. And I don't mean to imply that field reps aren't revenue generating, but you know what I mean.
yeah.
But I think the thing I'd be curious about is if you're an engineer who's in a situation. So the other challenge that we talk about are things like AI tools like Copilot, where you're in Visual Studio, VS Code, whatever it is, and you have a little thing that says, just write for me the 5 switch statements off of the status type and just write 30 of the lines. I then need to go and write the complex details within each one of those lines, but it's giving you starting points. That feels like something that's a helpful tool for me as an engineer to go and just do my job more efficiently. Low code, no code doesn't feel like. I'd be curious how many engineers are going to get benefit out of low code, no code for those external tools. And it sounds like it might be more than I'm anticipating, but I was looking at low code, no code as like the former steel worker who taught himself or, C# to go write ASP.NET pages for a massive organization. That felt like the type of person who could benefit from low code, no code by being able to have the tool do a bunch of the work for them and make them productive. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
A sentence I've never said before.
it gets tricky, right? Too, because you can actually look at things like the Spring Boot framework as technically being low code.
Okay, sure.
So there's definitely a differentiator between the user interface. But if you go look up Flutter they have plenty of things in production, right? So from a mobile development, that I feel like is just a no-brainer. I think for internal applications, it's a no-brainer, right? Like I'm not
Right.
saying everybody should just move to no code, low code tomorrow. I'm saying they are teams that don't get funded. They don't have engineers. They have small engineering teams and they fly under the radar. And from previous conversations on other episodes, you'll hear yourself, right? That human resources, we get very little support from the technology organization, right? So
Right.
to me, that's no-brainers. And then I think what I'd like to see on the software engineering side in the core domains and the secret sauce is you'd have to go crazy. No one's saying move to Power Apps, but there's one, stop writing your own data access layer.
Right.
Two, you're not going to build a better cron.
Right.
So unless there's a reason to go build your own scheduler, fit into a framework,
Right.
I'd like to see, I would be happy in my career if I see engineering make that step forward.
And I am curious, there's a psychological aspect to that, which is if you're just unfamiliar with this and your pattern in your head as you're talking through how you're going to solve it is, how a cron job is going to work and what those intervals are, and you're just not familiar with the idea that you could stream that data directly and in the stream do the transform that the cron would do, then is it just ego again is the wrong word, but it is a natural human instinct to resist change and the unknown is scary. And so am I going to appear less valuable to my leaders and my business if I say, I've never had to do a non-cron job based version of this? What do you mean there's an alternative? Is that just human nature not wanting to face that kind of thing? And how can a business provide a level of comfort or a level of security to an engineer to say, yeah, it's okay that you don't know this. You're going to have to learn this on the job and embrace the change. And that we're not going to view that as a bad thing. We're going to view that as you getting better with us. And I'm not sure all organizations are set up to make engineers feel that way, and therefore you end up stuck in old patterns.
Yeah, sometimes it's even less malicious, and it's working in a large company can feel differently than working in a startup where I can look over the wall and say, hey, is 20K a lot of money for a 2-year license for this technology? And
Right.
it's a 15-minute decision. That can feel different in a big company where it's like, well, wait a minute, now I got to go find and evaluate multiple solutions to fit into our architecture. So I've got to find people on the team. So it's resource allocation and people going and researching and finding these things and working with an architecture team to help us decide on the right tech. And then I've got to now travel through time and go back and add it to my budget because I didn't know I was going to have to buy this. So
right.
I think sometimes it's just human nature to think, well, I'll add it in 2 sprints time and we'll just start coding it because I don't want to have to go through this whole rigmarole to find it and fund it. I think that can be intimidating for teams too. So sometimes it's just climate and environment that can turn people off from going and acquiring that tech.
Well, and I'd also go back and say that that goes back to, are you working in a collaborative squad? Do you have trust in your product and your other people? Because I wouldn't expect you as the engineer, especially to your point, if you're in a startup and the three of you can just decide really quickly, yay or nay. But when you are in these larger organizations that for good and bad reasons have all of this extra red tape, do you think of your product owner or your product manager or someone else on your team as a partner who could help you go and make that business case? You don't need to spend 3 weeks doing that. It's probably not going to be the 15-minute startup conversation, but there are other people who you could tap into who are going to help you make that business case. And I'm not sure everyone thinks that, I'm not sure if you're in a big organization as the engineering lead, do you always think of your partners that way as somebody who can help you solve this? Yeah, I just don't know that we all partner together the right way.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of my favorite points of the night. That's the second compliment I've given you. So
It's the third. I have to pay you so much on Venmo.
that's one of my favorite points because I do think that, and I do think part of what I like about myself is I have become a yes man. Sometimes to a fault, which is like, hey, I need this. Can you go research it? And I'm like, yes, and
Right.
off I go, and I bring back the options. And sometimes, in early in my career, I might have completely misunderstood the ask. I like to think I'm better now, but I'm bringing back options and I'm telling you the pros and cons. And that largely has become part of my job as an enterprise architect, right? Is to go do that evaluation based on the requirements. And I do think you're right. I do think there's an apprehension and not even lack of trust, sometimes lack of trust, but people on the technology side don't feel empowered to ask that of their product organization.
Right.
And say, hey, I need this. Can you go figure that out for us?
Right.
So I do like that. I do like that point. I could see how that's a big driver in not doing further research.
So, what are we going to recommend to people? How are we going to help people? I think the first one is we can link to the evaluation criteria you posted on the blog a couple of weeks ago.
I think
as
so.
just ways of helping people structure those thought process. Your teams are often stuck in this process. And so when you're stuck in the software development lifecycle and what's the next step and how do we go from point A to the end of the sprint and how do I break this down, you stop being results oriented and you stop thinking about the value that you're driving from it. And when you stop thinking about the value, you start thinking about, well, then I need just to have this data access layer. I need to have this and that. And when value is no longer part of the conversation, then it doesn't force you to think, oh yeah, if we just went and licensed or used a library, I'd get to that value much quicker than me writing how many sprints of data access layer code.
Do consider that product partnership in the same way I work with you and consider you a business architect and say, hey, Kevin, walk me through this business process or this business thought, right? I think that's an important message.
Well, and I think that, in that partnership, the way that you should find the people to talk through and have that non-emotional, non-ego driven discussion. And I think you lay out some really good points in the blog post around, are you evaluating time to market? Are you evaluating your own requirements around flexibility and customization? Do you know what your scalability requirements are? Talk through what's the value we're going to get out of this with your business people, and then use that as the criteria to figure out, yeah, I wish I got to work on the cool, interesting code, and I'm going to push back on the only way that I think we're going to achieve this one piece of functionality is if we write it ourselves. I don't see Airflow doing that for us. I don't see the MongoDB connector doing that for us. We're going to have to write this ourselves. And you have that very structured conversation with people, and it helps everyone realize, oh, wait, that one thing that you think we can only do if we write our own MongoDB connector, that's not super important. You're right. That's not even a should, that's a could on our scale of requirements for this capability. And so by having those back and forth conversations, maybe you get to what the real value is for the product manager, and they can then push back and say, no, don't write your own code for that. You don't need to even account for that. I will happily strike that out, and that doesn't need to be a requirement for us. And so that's, structuring your conversation with people about all of these different pros and cons of whether or not we need to do it ourselves or use somebody else who's already done it for us can get you to a good conversation and get your product people to a more comprehensive understanding of their own requirements by looking at these trade-offs with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you liked what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is Jordan Jesse Go. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. To read articles we've written on similar topics to the ones we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at acceptancepod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog over there. We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptancepod. Acceptance Criteria and on Discord. You can find links to both in the show notes and on the blog. And I promise we'll be moderating the crap out of them to keep it a nice little slice of the internet. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at KThomasEuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.